Hello, and welcome to the Connections 2021 panel on the ethics of the opposing force. This is a very important topic, not only for how we design war games, but strategically for how the U.S. is going to fight and the potential correlation of forces in the fight. So I think this is going to be a very interesting panel. I'm going to let the panelists go ahead and introduce themselves. My name is Ed McGrady. I'm going to be behind the scenes as the moderator. Please put your questions in the Discord chat, and I will be posting them here for the panelists to answer. So
are you on the panel?
Let's start with Tom Meyer.
Hi, Tom Meyer. Brief little bit of background about myself. I've got about 40 years experience in wargaming, both from 20 years in the military, as a contractor, and also in the hobby industry. After leaving the military, I did some time with professional nonprofit fundraising, and afterwards decided that there was a possibility for me to combine both and form my company, Graymeyer Group LLC, where we do both nonprofit consulting and we still consult and work with war games and exercises in government and the hobby industry. Yeah, I'm glad to be here today.
Hey, good morning. My name is Dave Milliken. I'm a Army officer and recent graduate of the Wargaming Masters Program at CGSC, where I worked with our fellow panelists Mike Dunn and James Sterrett. I'm also a former OPFOR platoon leader, so hopefully I'll be able to bring a little bit to talk about that, as well as a Red Team member. Really happy to be here and looking forward to see what questions pop up. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Mike Dunn. I am the Battle Simulation Specialist for Command and General Staff College. Been a lifelong war gamer. I also spent 25 years in the Army. Started off as an armor officer and ended up as a simulation operations officer.
Great. Well, you've heard from all three of us. I'll start things off and remind people to put comments or questions down in the Discord chat, and then those will be passed along to us. Start things off. I wanted to just scope my comments today, and by making the assumption that a war game has been scheduled and a blue force and an opposing force have already been identified by exercise directors. And so to me, once you've decided who the blue force is, what the opposing force is going to be, what the exercise objectives are, we can talk about identifying and applying the ethical behavior of that opposing force. So the first challenge, I think, is portraying the different ethics of the OPFOR. One of the major impacts in this area is about the 10 or 12 different types of bias. It's a major factor. And that bias can be anything from self-image bias to regular image bias, prematurely formed views bias, a whole host of different bias that can affect the scenario designers as they assign the parameters with which they want the OPFOR commander and the OPFOR forces to operate. The two I want to talk about today, mirror image bias is one of the most common ones, where we would assign, or a designer would assign to the OPFOR the objectives and behavior the same as their own. A good example is if you were going to have some type of tactical war game and you say that both sides would be having the same objectives. Both may be trying to take land, both may be trying to influence people through propaganda. They've just assigned the enemy the exact same thought processes of the BLUFOR. You take the other end of the spectrum, and there's the denial of rationality bias, where the assumption is made that the OPFOR is a completely irrational performer and will do absolutely outrageous activities without thought, without giving them credit that they are also going to be rational actors. The second challenge, after you've maybe overcome and recognize that bias in assigning the behaviors that you want your OPFOR to operate on, is then to find war gamers and role players to accurately portray these ethical attributes. certainly a key challenge here is when the attributes, the ethical attributes that you've assigned to the OPFOR are very contrary to the BLUFOR or the role player's personal belief system. An example may be a BLUFOR is given maybe a standard, what I would consider a standard objectives of, we're going to go into a country, we're going to defend the population, and by doing that, we're going to secure the cities, protect railroads, protect supply lines, that type of action. Infrastructure, economy. We may be fighting an OPFOR that is not their objectives. That maybe, as we've seen sometimes, their objectives is pure destruction of the infrastructure or elimination of a portion of the population, such as in a genocide scenario. So finding a role player who can suspend their own ethical beliefs and accurately portray some of the more antithetical behaviors of an opposing force is a difficult thing to do, because their own personal bias may keep them from doing it just because they're not able to think outside the box, or they're not going to want to behave in that manner personally. So in addition, overcoming their personal bias is also then the pushback or negative reactions those individuals may get after they actually behave in the ethical manner we've given to the OPFOR, particularly the more outrageous or more heinous it might be, as in a genocide scenario or elimination of food, elimination of infrastructure scenario, where that OPFOR has chosen to be purely destructive, and our OPFOR role player performs that in a very active and accurate manner. They may subsequently receive pushback after the exercise is over. How could you ever do that? What made you think of that? What kind of a person can think of that when they were doing their best to actively role play the OPFOR roles assigned to them? So those, to me, were two of the major points I wanted to make today. And I think we're going to wait on questions until all three of us have presented. I'm going to pass it on to Dave.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. So transitioning from talking about the ethics or morals of OPFOR actions, I was going to try to bring up a couple points about the ethics of using an opposing force in your war game or in your training scenario. Up in front of you, I tried to lay out kind of the 4 ways that training with your OPFOR can go, and there's two major, what I think are two major axes. There's, does OPFOR or do OPFOR actions drive training, drive learning from the unit being trained? Does the unit come out of the training exercise better than they went in? And then are the actions of the OPFOR coherent? That is, do they have an internal logic applied to them? Is your OPFOR required to operate under the same pressures as the BLUFOR is, or is the OPFOR given, we'll say, advantages? And that's more than just the advantages of knowing the terrain. That's the advantages of not having to worry about supply, or, as Tom talked about, not having to adhere to the same ethical rules that we would hold ourselves to. So that kind of breaks down into 4 different possibilities. And in the top left corner, you've got what is the gold standard for using an opposing force. They're realistic. They are held to the same standards as BLUFOR, and that means they've got the same weaknesses. Like, you can attack OPFOR logistics, you can attack OPFOR command and control, you can get into the OPFOR OODA loop in the same way that you can do with BLUFOR, because all of those things are being simulated or being driven behind the scenes. That doesn't mean that that OPFOR actions aren't tailored to BLUFOR needs. We're not going to send an OPFOR battalion out against a BLUFOR squad That's not going to meet our training objectives. But at the end of the day, the word we use to describe this is responsible free play within the constraints of a scenario. From there, we had the situation where, well, we're not going to have free play. We're going to have the OPFOR essentially play the role of enablers controlled by a HICON or controlled by an observer controller. And that may look like OPFOR being maneuvered without restrictions that BLUFOR would have. That looks like what BLUFOR would call OPFOR cheating. And really what that looks like is OPFOR being a piece that the higher command is using to meet their overall training objectives. What you miss out on there is, well, maybe BLUFOR has found a way to impede the OPFOR from ever even reaching the training area. In that case, the BLUFOR has made the correct choice in trying to interdict those OPFOR, but that's not going to work within the OC scenario. And what that appears to the BLUFOR to be is cheating. I've done the correct thing, and what does that mean if I've done the correct thing and I haven't seen the correct training outcome? And then from there, we've got, what happens if the OPFOR is coherent or is internally consistent, but they don't drive training change within BLUFOR? Like we talked about, that looks like, well, we send a battalion out against a squad, or maybe we send a platoon out against a BLUFOR division. That does nothing to drive BLUFOR training. All it does is it makes people think, well, they're cheating anyway. Like, what does it matter? I just need to get through NTC. It's only 10 days in the box, and then I can be out of here. What real training comes out of that if BLUFOR comes into a scenario thinking, whatever I do, I'm going to lose, or possibly worse, whatever I do, I'm going to win. And then the final thing that we have is, what happens if BLUFOR is neither consistent nor able to drive change? And that's something that we saw a lot when we were trying to model unethical behavior on the part of OPFOR, to Tom's point, or even to model what it looked like to operate as a insurgent cell among the OPFOR. We would have, we'd have people in galabias dressed in traditional clothing, but totally unable to really understand their place within the scenario. An example I might give is, if anybody's been involved in key leader engagements, where it turns out that the person you're speaking with doesn't actually speak the language they're pretending to speak. This is really common when you're going to the Dari-speaking parts of Afghanistan, and you run into a role player at JRTC or at NTC that actually speaks Arabic. You call them out on it, and what are they going to do? They are acting as if they are foreign, or they're acting as if they are other. And again, it destroys what we might call the magic circle involved in trying to create a scenario or war game this. I know a lot of this, what I'm talking about, applies mostly to real life wargaming and scenarios, but it's no different than analog or digital systems. If you are a puckster on JCATs and you see units moving from place to place totally unrealistically, it shatters your illusion that what you're doing is actual training, and it makes you think, well, maybe I'm just here to get through this. I'm just here to check this block. And as I've tried to illustrate in the slide, there's a definite degradation in the quality. Starting at the top left, yeah, maybe you begin with free play and a realistic OPFOR, but because of poor scenario design, you need to start creating what we call injects and say, well, in order to meet our training objectives, we need to have a battle happen in 15 Tango in a certain area. So now it's really no longer free play; it's become scripted. And then from there, it's easy to devolve into a unit that is no longer able to drive change among your training audience. And so for that reason, when we talk about ethics of the opposing force, I'd really divide anything that drives change in the training audience to be, ethical as far as scenario designing go, and anything that doesn't drive change, that's no longer ethical for us to be in the way that we use our opposing force. So when we think about ethics in OPFOR, the bottom line is it's more than just what is the opposing force doing. You know, are they doing things that we would not consider ethical? It's worth thinking about, well, how are we using the OPFOR to drive change? And are we making an ethical use of the Blue Force's training time? Because at the end of the day, we expect them to be put into a life and death scenario. We expect them to succeed and come back home based on the value of the training that we give. And if we're not giving our best, we are absolutely negligent. And I'll pause there for a moment and then pass the torch over to Mike Dunn. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, David. I'm actually going to change the lens that we're looking through just slightly off from what Tom and David had done. I'm talking about some of the more relevant ethical issues that we are wrestling with even today. And I think it's a recognition that what we are doing is essentially a human activity, which is not completely dispassionate. I'm not sure we're capable of doing that, but does bring up emotional responses. I'm going to talk about the sensitivity and historical representation of wargaming, and I've got three broad areas I want to take a look at. I'm going to start off with the semiotics found in wargaming, basically the symbols and what they stand for and how we portray them. Three good examples I'd like to go ahead and talk about is the Nazi swastika. As most of you know, the swastika prior to the Nazi Party taking hold of it was essentially a very ancient symbol in religions throughout humanity. However, when you see a swastika today, that's not what you're thinking of. You are thinking of specifically the Nazis and the atrocities that they had committed. Another example is the Confederate battle flag. It had been commonly understood that if you see the Confederate battle flag, you are referring to the Army of Virginia. However, over time, the Confederate battle flag has come to mean the Confederacy in general, and even more recently, it has come to mean the ideals that the Confederacy was founded upon. So you do have an emotional response to the Confederate battle flag to this very day. And let's take a look at the Soviet hammer and sickle. The Soviets were just as objectively evil, and as you could say that the Nazis were, also guilty of just very heinous acts. But what is the appropriate way to represent them in our games? What's the symbology that we use? And curiously, what we're seeing is the Nazi symbology essentially being replaced by other Germanic and Teutonic symbols, such as the Balkan cross and the Maltese cross in place of the swastika. We're seeing some movement to replace the Confederate battle flag with other symbols, such as the original Stars and Bars flag, which is not as well known and doesn't evoke the same emotion that the battle flag does. And the Soviet hammer and sickle rarely ever brings forth the same emotional response that, say, the swastika does, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. But it kind of gets at to the human activity that's involved here. And as we seen, symbols do change their meanings over time, and this is due to the second piece, which is the teleology of why those symbols are used, and which talks about the reenactors as an example. Are they history enthusiasts? Are they sympathizers? Are the people that are portraying Wehrmacht soldiers or SS soldiers in World War II reenacting, are they Nazi sympathizers, or are Confederate reenactors neo-Confederates? Probably not, but again, it's going to really depend on the teleology of the participants. Do you have the people that are reenacting out of a true history enthusiasm, where they want to show how things were. At the same time, they vehemently disagree with what the cause was that they were fighting for. Other times, however, you really have to take it on an individual by individual basis. I think what we see in the hobby gaming field is the wearaboo phenomenon, where you've got some of those game players and game designers that seem to have a very unsavory admiration for all things SS. And there is, Lord knows, there's no end of games out there that you've got all sorts of ahistorical benefits for the units portrayed as SS or as American Civil War Confederates. It all gets to where are the sympathies of the designer and the participants. And let's go ahead and talk about some of the game topics and war games in general. Game topics themselves can elicit a very emotional reaction. Let's take, for instance, the case of GMT's Scramble for Africa game, which had gotten canceled due to the fact that there was a somewhat of an outcry that perhaps gaming the European colonization and brutal suppression of the inhabitants of Africa may not be an appropriate game to model. Well, how do you balance that? You also look at some of the titles that Hollenspiel Games has published, games such as Infamous Traffic and This Guilty Land, which deals with slavery. And I think the way that Hollenspiel approached it is from a place of, I'm going to say sensitivity, but also an understanding that even though we are gaming and portraying what is undeniably evil activities, there is something that can be gained from participating in such a game, elucidating an understanding of how these things were to arise. I think we've seen in some of the other conference committees and conference presentations, how do we address these ethical issues, and how do we do so from that sensitivity, yet still being faithful to the history that is being done, which gets down to the final three questions. Where is the line? Is there a line? And should there be a line? Again, we need to understand that wargaming is a human activity, and part of being human is having those very visceral responses to events and to the history, and that we need to be very, very sensitive when we do so. And that wraps it up for the three of us, and I think it's time for any questions that we may have from our viewership. I think I see the first question I presented.
Mike, I can start off with this one.
Okay.
So when we talk about inculcating OPFOR from psychological impact, we're talking about a living, breathing OPFOR. And in my experience, you generally don't ask your role players to actually commit war crimes. It's one thing to do it as part of a tabletop exercise, but we're not asking one of the OPFOR soldiers at one of the CTCs to simulate murdering someone or beating civilians or committing any of these crimes as part of free play. There may be a time when those events are scripted in order to drive a response from BLUFOR. But as a platoon leader, I was never given guidance, and I never gave guidance to any of my soldiers to go out and commit a war crime on the battlefield. It's not necessary to do that in order to drive a learning response in BLUFOR. You're not going to do it directly in front of them. That would lead to hopefully them intervening. And unless that's the purpose, there's not a huge reason for that to come up. Now that may be different in different CTCs, but I mean that's been my experience. There's more efficient ways to drive the response among the BLUFOR than by giving direction and guidance to soldiers to go commit war crimes.
I'm going to jump in on that. I think for training purposes and for educational purposes, that it is imperative that we do have a accurate representation of the portrayal of the opposing force's behaviors. We do, however, need to take a check on ourselves to make sure that we are not inadvertently inculcating some of those values into our own repertoire. I use as an example of that is how the techniques that were used in SEER training to help our service members that find themselves as enemy prisoners of war of how to withstand the essentially torturous behavior that they may encounter. Unfortunately, we saw those techniques actually find their way into our kit bag during Iraq and Afghanistan. I say that with the recognition that war in itself is a very slippery slope. All three of us on this panel had actually served in war zones over the past 20 years, and we definitely understand this very viscerally. So it is incumbent on us to basically place a check on ourselves to say, hey, what are we doing here? And basically be very straight with ourselves as to what are we portraying and why are we portraying it. Tom, you're muted.
Hello. Thank you. This goes back to my second main point on my slide. I'm glad this question was asked. Is part of it goes to, what was the purpose that the OPFOR was given? But I kind of also take part of this, the psychological impact on the people that we have playing the OPFOR. And how do they do it? When I was preparing for this presentation, I spoke to some of my peers about this particular topic, and they had not spent a lot of time role-playing OPFOR, and even one of them was like, well, when I got to talking about genocide and some of the other what we would consider anti-ethical, poor ethical behaviors, they were like, well, I couldn't do that. And so to me, I think that all of the U.S. military services spend time training a portion of their force to be opposing force. Either a lot of times it's the intelligence personnel, and then they've each kind of developed some flavor of some type of red team academy to train them to be able to suspend some of their own beliefs and training and replace it on a temporary basis to accurately role play the opposing force. And to this particular question, the psychological impact is real just for that very reason, because you're asking a BLUFOR player to then go against his own ethical beliefs, even in the purposes for a training objective. That still takes a certain amount of training and wherewithal on a individual level to enact that. That's all I have on that.
No, I think that, Tom, you make an awesome point. And to be clear, I don't think we're asking our OPFOR soldiers to do unethical things. The same rules apply to soldiers whether or not you're wearing the black uniform or you're wearing camo. OPFOR soldiers aren't just allowed to shoot through their comrades in order to hit the target. I mean, that would have been a major issue if my soldiers had done something like that. If there's a war crime that needs to be committed to try to elicit a certain response from the BLUFOR, it's a lot easier to just have HICON send them a message saying, hey, a war crime has been committed in this village. We don't need to go through the steps of teaching someone to commit a war crime and then having a debrief afterwards in order to get that effect. We can do it on paper, and it's honestly it's more effective.
And you made the good point too, is that, and Mike also, but I think all of us have agreed that it's definitely, when you're going to go to there, it's definitely got to be for a specific training objective and not just something off the cuff that's thrown in there to get a reaction.
So I think that gets to what you were talking about earlier is are people committing, is the OPFOR committing war crimes because they're immoral actors and they're uniquely evil, or are they committing war crimes because it is going to help them reach their end state? A lot of times we frame it as a moral question, and without a doubt, there's a component of it that is, but people aren't just out committing crimes for no particular reason. I mean, that's the definition of a psychopath.
Mike, do you have anything else?
No, let's go ahead and head on to the next question.
Next question, please.
Yeah, let me go ahead and start off with this one. I think you need to recognize that all societies have their own unique way of looking at things. Culture is, by definition, the values of what we adhere to. And I think that even our allies and our partners, yes, they may be in general aligned with what we consider to be American values, but keep in mind that they also have their own unique values. So I think it's something that we need to have a recognition towards, that we cannot fall into the mindset that, hey, if you scratch a foreigner, you're going to find an American underneath. Well, that's just not true. You need to understand and appreciate the social values that our partners and our allies have, and just to keep that in mind as we're portraying them.
This is definitely something that's more difficult to model, in that generally a training event is not going to be zero sum. In that everybody gets to win at the end of the training event, you and your partners. That's not always the case during an actual operation. There are going to be competing demands, and not everybody is going to get what they want. I see this as a very, very, very difficult to model the friction that comes from working with a partner in a training environment. That's not an easy thing to model in a game, physical or analog.
Well, I guess my thought here too is that the logic does apply, because what we've said is, or what I've said, I don't want to speak for anybody else, is that you want to very clearly identify what the behavioral pattern is of the OPFOR, and then give that guidance to whoever's role playing the OPFOR. And I would say that can be applied to any allied or partners, because while we may have some objectives in common, we're also going to have a number of objectives that are not in common, and so making sure that we accurately portray those in a war game is very important.
It's a great point. So the idea that comes to mind when we talk about role-playing partners is key leader engagements, where I've got to go out and I've got to meet with an elder or a partner commander. And generally those are war gamed, or those are scripted very, very poorly, because it's difficult to create a scenario where the role player has an incentive to play along with you. Give you an example. What generally happens when we do key leader engagements is, the young platoon leader comes in and he does everything that he's told. He doesn't use his left hand. He keeps his feet flat on the ground. And no matter what happens at the end of the exercises, he gets yelled at and kicked out of the office. He's told to be firm, to be indirect. Here's what I'd say: if I had treated my my counterparts in Afghanistan the way that I was trained to do in KLEs, I would have either had harm done to me, or I would have just never been allowed to return back to have another meeting like that. It's much more difficult to script that that partner interaction than we pretend it is. I'll stop there.
And I think one of the things that is in line with portraying the OPFOR with some fidelity is sometimes our partners and allies that we are working with may have values that we would consider to be absolutely abhorrent. Lord knows that some of the folks I worked with in Southwest Asia definitely did not share the same values that we did, yet they were our allies and our partners. So, and I think that's one of the things that we need to bring into our training exercises and perhaps even to our gaming experience is how do we create that tension?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're ready for the next question.
I would argue by several. And again, it gets to those cultural nuances that we need to recognize. And in fact, from a complete utilitarian perspective, it actually might be something that we can use as a technique to exploit the seam between the differences of cultural values. But yes, I think just for it is worthwhile to portray that. OPFOR is not OPFOR is not OPFOR.
Yeah, I absolutely I concur. Yeah.
So let me push back a little bit, because I think the question here is the purpose of this complex scenario to train a unit, or is it an analytical scenario? Are we trying to figure out what happens from the interaction between the different OPFOR subunits or the different OPFOR units, or is the purpose to train somebody? If you have multiple competing opposing forces, it's really easy to have that scenario devolve into infighting between those two opposing forces. Now, is that realistic? Yeah, absolutely. But is that the best way to get a training value for that unit? No, it's definitely not. And I think that's a scenario where you'd try to have responsible scripted play rather than responsible free play. Because if you gamed it out, maybe it turns out that it's in one of the OPFOR unit's best interest to only attack the other OPFOR at the expense of the BLUFOR. And if there's no way for a BLUFOR action to change that, to force or to compel another OPFOR unit to attack themselves or their partners, what are we really modeling here other than some confusion for the BLUFOR where they don't see their actions resulting in some kind of outcome. So again, I think it depends. Is it for the purpose of training or the purpose of analysis that we have multiple free OPFOR units?
Next question.
I would say no, as long as the OPFOR is being faithful to the enemy that they're portraying. I don't consider that to be cheating. I actually consider that to be an accurate portrayal as something that we need to be cognizant of, whether in a training exercise or a professional game. We need to be able to accurately portray the actions of our adversaries.
Yeah, Mike, I'd agree with that. I mean, that's no different than the Algerians saying that it's not cheating for them to use bombs when they don't have an air force. The OPFOR is going to use whatever they have at their capability or in their capacity in order to achieve their mission, bounded by their own ethical framework. So, no, I wouldn't call that cheating at all.
Yeah, I'd agree. It goes back to the objectives of the war game and what the parameters were, because if there's too much deviation from the proposed plan and learning objectives and training objectives of the exercise, then you have diluted from the purpose of the training exercise. That's not to say that things that are thought of by a thinking OPFOR can't be documented and recorded for a possible follow-on war game, but you certainly, for purposes of it depends on what the objectives of the war game were, but there's got to be left and right boundaries. But certainly you do want a free thinking OPFOR.
Oh, I think that's a good answer to that one.
Okay, we'll take the next question. You guys bring us the next question?
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. Thank you.
That's actually a really good question, and that's one of the things that when it comes to putting together an OPFOR, either for a training exercise or for an actual wargame event, is that we should probably, it's imperative for us to put the OPFOR under the conditions that is faithful to the way they operate. I think we've seen too many times at the combat training centers and in some of our own professional games where we was essentially BLUFOR folks wearing a red uniform, using the same techniques and procedures that Blue would use, just using different equipment, using different stats. And I think for the purposes of being ethical to our training imperatives and educational imperatives is that we should have OPFOR react and act as faithfully as possible to how they really would.
Yeah, I guess there's two inputs for this. I mean, are you red teaming your plan and trying to see your plan the way the opposing force is going to see it? That goes without saying that's important. And then two, are you including a living member of the opposing force in your after action review to get their view of what actually happened? Those are the two places where I'd put it in. Yeah, no, I absolutely include those things.
Yeah, another piece of that to think about is the how much information do you want the OPFOR to have about the BLUFOR's plan? Part of it is limitations on how robust of an OPFOR you can have. So you have to provide them some information to replicate the fact that they do have their own planning teams, their own collection teams, their own analysis sections, but you may not have the resources to do that. On the other hand, giving them too much information to a free-thinking OPFOR, and they're able to go immediately right to BLUFOR vulnerabilities or see through deception planning on the BLUFOR, which then in itself may defeat a learning or training objective because it was kind of artificially operated because of what I would say is insider information. So it may be that your OPFOR SMEs that are helping during the planning cycle then would have to hand off the parameters to the actual active thinking OPFOR and then step back from it as a way to mitigate that possible influence or insider information, so to speak.
Let me go ahead and tag into that. Is the way that the U.S. and our allies do their planning processes, we typically will take into consideration the enemy's most likely course of action and the enemy's most dangerous course of action. So it shouldn't just be the OPFOR that's considering the different COA variants. It's essentially us as planners that have to do that as well.
Agreed. We're probably ready for the next question.
Well, actually, quite a bit. I'm going to actually defer to David here, since this is definitely his wheelhouse.
Yeah, David, you better go off on this one.
I don't want to disappoint you, but I'd say not a lot. So there's a lot of different places where this training occurs, and also a lot of the CTCs will have an OPFOR Academy that you go through. It's a week-long training event, and really it teaches you how training at that CTC works. how to work with an OC, how to use the physical site-specific equipment. For example, you might not use your 152 radios. You might use a commercial radio to communicate between yourself, the OCs, the role players, and then the people who produce the battlefield effects. And a lot of that is for incoming units that are coming to help, whether it's a National Guard unit on AT or it's a foreign unit coming to train. When I was in Hohenfels, we would put on an OPFOR academy to train everybody on the specifics of the upcoming mission. So there's broad training, there is rotation specific training, and then really the training that gets done for individual OPFOR soldiers is no different than training that gets done for soldiers at any other unit in the Army. Infantrymen at a CTC, I mean, they are competing for their EIB every year and learning how to do all of the basic tasks of an infantry soldier or a mechanized soldier at any other unit. The difference in training is really more in the experiential learning that takes place, especially among squad leaders and platoon leaders, where everybody is participating in the rotation essentially one level up. A platoon leader will act as an OPFOR company commander. A squad leader will act as a OPFOR platoon leader. That's where a big bulk of that learning comes from. So that's OPFOR specific at a CTC. When we're looking at a warfighter, we have contractors who are running a lot of the OPFOR equipment. There is a green suit commander, and then there are some junior captains that are helping to run it, and really they are getting a lot of sets and reps at how to defeat BLUFOR units at Estrelon. And so again, that comes down to on the job training. And then the final thing really at the staff level, we at one time had a red team academy that worked on getting people to think from the adversary's point of view. Unfortunately, that's something that we no longer have in our arsenal of schools. So really, Mike, I'm sorry to answer differently. But as far as formal training goes, I would say there's really not a lot. It is, and I don't really know how much it's necessary for individual soldiers, because you're getting 10, 11, 12 opportunities every single year to work on your craft. And if you don't do a good job at it, if you fail to conduct engagement area development, you'll be back out next Saturday, making sure you get validated at that task.
Okay, I think we're ready for the next question. Understanding that the men behind the curtain are furiously trying to keep up. Okay, that's a pretty difficult question to answer. And again, gets back to my comment that we really need to keep a check on ourselves to find out, just to ensure that we are not falling into that trap. I think back to the infamous Stanford experiment, where you had part of the participants acting as prisoners and other parts of the participants acting as the actual prison guards. And then it devolved into the brutality being adopted by the college students that were portraying the prison guards. Was an absolute shock and horror to everybody involved in that experiment. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of, is that we do, even though our OPFOR is portraying essentially unacceptable activity, we need to, again, keep that check on ourselves to ensure that we are not inadvertently inculcating these people into these really unethical behaviors.
Well, I'd say another way to look at this question, because it is kind of open, is the way I'm seeing the question is a concern about, hey, what if an OPFOR role player is attempting to conduct activities that aren't really in line with the OPFOR ethics. And it might be, to me, I think that kind of might go back to the bias where they've been told to be a free-thinking OPFOR, and they're like, wow, this is a great idea. This is what we should do. But in the scheme of the parameters of what the OPFOR has been given, it doesn't fit with them, even though it may or may not, or may be a great test for the BLUFOR training opportunity. If it's outside the bounds of what the parameters of the OPFOR ethics, and then it may be counterproductive in the long run.
I would say probably not ignore that. It is something that has a planner. You could discount the fact that that might happen, but this gets back into the category of wargaming against the most dangerous course of action that you may face. So it's one of those things that you really can't do a hand wave on.
Yeah, I mean, it's only a vulnerability if the OPFOR has a way to target it, or a critical vulnerability at that point. So I don't see anybody ignoring a vulnerability. That may be an assumption, but you still need to guard against it. So ultimately,
I think it makes it very difficult for a BLUFOR to train and take away valid lessons if you've given the parameters of an OPFOR, a free-thinking OPFOR, and then to meet a training objective, something skews from out of left field, because then they've got a lot. Then they get some negative reinforcement. You know, they've gone through the processes. We've taught them to assess and war game, and here's our vulnerabilities. And they may have even said, oh, hey, we got to protect that vulnerability, but in the end, that vulnerability doesn't get attacked. I mean, that's realistic in and of itself. You may have a vulnerability that either the other side can't get to or is incapable of getting to in that particular scenario.
Sure. I mean, that speaks to the larger amount of risk aversion a lot of times that we train into people. It's, you know, it is much more, it's much easier to train people to think that there's a threat around every corner than it is to teach people to really gauge the temperature of the risk in the area that they're at. You know, if every piece of trash is an IED, you're not going anywhere. That's something I'd say we probably don't do a good enough job of is measuring and taking acceptable risks.
Anything else, Mike?
Nope. I think we're ready for the next question.
Okay. I think we may be on our last question. Getting down to the end.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this one in saying that, yes, there really is a danger that you are stereotyping. It is one thing to ascribe general behaviors to our opposing forces. It's a whole other thing to say that, yes, they will always act this way, and that these people will always do this action because they're terrible people and have terrible values. Well, no, we need to understand that in different societies, just like our own culture is varies quite a bit, and we have values from that range for quite a bit. I think we need to recognize that most of our OPFOR societies are not monolithic, that they are going to have some differences between the different parts of those cultures that the OPFOR is coming from.
Yeah, I'm going to agree also that this danger is real. And I can go back, if we want to look at a little history, is when the Cold War came to an end, when the wall came down and we started having access to military writings, a lot more of the military writings from Russia and the Soviet Union, one of the things that became readily apparent was that despite the rather lockstep method of attack that we had trained for all those years, there was a lot more flexibility in their doctrine than we had really apparently maybe given them credit for. If you were to, you read some of the writings, and some of their military tacticians and leaders and strategists were talking about some of the more, a lot more flexibility in their plan than we had trained for, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure like at the CTCs that people are training to only fight in one specific way. You're expected 1 month to train a high intensity armored force against armored force rotation. The next month you may be doing coin rotation, more counterinsurgency on foot, and then another month you may be training for KFOR, where you're really more replicating protests. This is, is it a big concern, like Tom pointed out, to think our enemies are monolithic or our competitors are monolithic? Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that's that we're seeing that among the living OPFOR at a CTC though.
Okay.
Okay, I think that was the last question. I really am glad that we got a chance to explore this topic, and I know there's a lot more that can be said about it. In fact, I will go into the Discord chat server and look at any other additional questions that may come up. But yes, this has been a really wonderful discussion, I'd like to think.
Yep, I had a great time. Thanks all.
And Echo, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks so much. We'll see you all over on the Discord server.